Harper Lansing set the termination letter down on the polished walnut table and looked across at the man in the gray work shirt. Malik Kingston did not speak. She read the line aloud. 17 late arrivals in 4 months. He did not explain. He did not apologize. He nodded once, stood, and walked out. Bradford Whitcomb was waiting in the hallway, arms folded, half a smile resting on his mouth. That evening, at her mother's kitchen table in Dilworth, Eleanor poured tea and mentioned the new neighbor. "He's very kind. Fixed the roof for me. Wouldn't take $1. Harper asked his name. Eleanor said, "Malik." 5 months before that letter was signed, a rented moving truck, the color of dust, pulled up in front of a small clapboard house on Maple Bend Road, on the quiet northern edge of Charlotte, North Carolina. The truck carried fewer boxes than the trip deserved. A girl of about 8, with 2 long braids and serious brown eyes, climbed down from the passenger side and looked up at the row of oaks lining the street. "Is this it, Dad?" she asked. Malik Kingston shut the driver's door and came around the front of the truck. "This is it, Imani." He had picked the house for 2 reasons. It was the cheapest one in the school district he needed, and the porch faced east, so the kitchen would catch the morning light. After his wife died 3 years before, small details like that had become important to him in a way he could not entirely explain to anyone, not even to himself. He set down a box that contained almost nothing he had owned before her funeral, and he stood for a moment on the cracked walkway and looked at the house. And he told himself, the way a man tells himself certain sentences when no one is listening, that this was a good place for a child to grow up. Across the low picket fence, a woman in a faded sun hat was kneeling in a bed of late tomatoes. She straightened when she saw them, brushed soil from her gloves, and waved with the easy authority of someone who had lived on that block for 40 years. "Welcome to the neighborhood. I'm Eleanor Lansing." Malik lifted a hand. "Malik, this is Imani." Eleanor smiled at the girl with a warmth that did not need to be performed. "Well, I have entirely too many tomatoes this year. If you eat them, they're yours." That was how it started. Quietly, the way most real things begin, with a fence, and a vegetable, and an unforced kindness offered before anyone had earned it. Imani took 2 tomatoes carefully in her hands as if they were eggs, and Eleanor watched her cross the lawn back to her father. And something settled in the older woman's chest that had not been settled for some time. Eleanor had not noticed how empty her front yard had become until a child crossed it. 3 weeks later, Malik filled out an application at Lansing Logistics, a regional distribution company with a long warehouse off the freeway south of town. The application said warehouse associate. Under previous employment, he wrote 3 short lines that explained almost nothing. A community college maintenance job, a short stint at a moving company, a line about a regional supply firm that no longer existed under that name. Nothing on the page suggested the man who had filled it out. Maggie Doyle, the shift manager, glanced over the application, watched him during the floor walk, and offered him the job before lunch. She told her husband that night, over leftover meatloaf, that the new hire knew more about pallet flow than anyone she had ever interviewed in 22 years of warehouse work, and she did not understand why on earth he was applying for the entry shift. Her husband shrugged and asked if she had hired him. She said she had. He said then it was none of her business why. But Maggie kept thinking about it anyway, and on the drive home the next morning she found herself watching for his car in the lot. Malik's morning began at 5:30. He fried 2 eggs, packed Imani's lunch in a small canvas bag with her name embroidered on the strap, and at 6:15 he buckled her into the back of his old gray sedan and drove 40 minutes northwest to Belmont, where the regional gifted program met in a low brick building behind a Methodist church. The drive was the same every morning. He listened to whatever audiobook she had chosen the night before, and she watched the road signs go by, and they did not always talk. And the silence was the kind of silence that only people who trust each other can sit inside. Some mornings she fell asleep against the door before they reached the bypass, and he would adjust the rearview mirror to look at her without slowing down. By the time he dropped her off at the gate, hugged her quickly, and drove back through morning traffic to the warehouse, it was 7:50. The shift began at 7:30. On his best days, he was 20 minutes late. He never complained. He never explained. He simply worked through his lunch break and stayed late, and the math, on paper, always came out even. The other men on the loading dock had stopped asking about him after the first week. They had decided, without saying so, that whatever he was carrying was his own to carry. In the glass tower across town, Harper Lansing sat through her 9th board meeting since her father's funeral. Bradford Whitcomb, who had been her father's chief operating officer for 12 years, was reading from a clipboard about workforce discipline. The numbers, he said, had slipped since the leadership transition. He did not look at her when he said it. He did not have to. She watched him from the head of the table and tried to remember whether her father had ever spoken with that particular tone, and decided he had not. After the meeting, Maggie passed another floor supervisor in the corridor and slowed her step. She mentioned, quietly and without emphasis, that of the 8 warehouse employees Bradford had personally pulled into formal discipline over the past 6 months, 6 were black. The shift roster did not break that way. The supervisor looked at her for a long beat, said nothing, and kept walking. Maggie noted the silence and the look together and filed both away. She had been at Lansing Logistics long enough to recognize the difference between a man who did not see a pattern and a man who saw it and chose not to name it. She did not know yet what she would do with the observation. She knew only that she could not unsee it, and that her own silence had a price she had not yet finished paying. That Thursday evening, on her first walking tour of the floor, Harper passed through the loading bay and stopped without quite knowing why. A man in a gray shirt was repositioning a row of pallets. He was working alone, slowly, with the kind of patience that made it look easy. The flow of the aisle had changed. She could see it from where she stood. Faster pick, shorter walk. No one had told him to do that. The dock supervisor she had spoken to 10 minutes earlier had been complaining about throughput. And here was a man quietly solving the problem the supervisor was complaining about without being asked, without being thanked, without lifting his head to see whether anyone had noticed. Bradford appeared at her elbow within 30 seconds. "Don't get distracted, Harper. The contracts are upstairs." She let him lead her away. She glanced back once. Malik never looked up. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the forklifts moved in their steady patterns, and a man in a gray shirt finished his row of pallets and moved on to the next without anyone marking the work. On Monday morning, an email went out under Bradford's signature to every warehouse employee. The subject line read, "Zero tolerance, late arrival policy, 3 strikes." The policy said, would now trigger a formal disciplinary review. 5 strikes meant termination. There were no exceptions for personal circumstance, no review of family situation, no accommodation for medical or educational obligations. Several of the warehouse staff read the email twice and went silent for the rest of the morning. 2 of them looked at each other across the break room and did not need to say what they were thinking. The coffee in the pot went cold while the 8 o'clock shift sat staring at their phones, and someone at the back of the room said something low and bitter that nobody asked him to repeat. Maggie read it twice in her office, then walked down the hall to the elevator and rode up to the executive floor. She had worked at Lansing Logistics for 22 years, since the late William Lansing was still on the floor in shirt sleeves checking pallet counts himself, and in all those years she had never once needed to speak to anyone above her direct supervisor. The assistant on the executive floor was polite. She told Maggie that Miss Lansing was in budget reviews until 5, and that all meeting requests were to be routed through the COO's office. Maggie left a written note anyway, folded neatly, with her name and extension on the front. The note vanished by the next morning, and no meeting was offered. Harper, for her part, never saw it. Down in the warehouse, Malik kept working. He noticed the new policy and did not change his routine, because his routine had been built around the only fact in his life that could not be moved. Imani's school began at 7. The drive was 40 minutes. He would be late. He simply worked through his breaks to make up the time, the way he had done for 4 months already, and accepted that the math was the math. That afternoon, on the drive to pick up his daughter, he passed a billboard advertising a logistics conference his old company would be presenting at, and he kept his eyes on the road and did not look up. That evening, on the floor corridor near the forklift bay, An older black warehouse worker named Otis stopped beside Malik as he was checking a pallet count and spoke without looking up from his own tablet. "You're the third one this year, brother. Don't think that's a coincidence." Malik did not answer. He nodded once, slowly, and went back to the row of boxed shipments. Otis moved on. Neither of them spoke again that night, but Malik thought about the sentence on the drive home, with Imani asleep in the back seat, and the streetlights moving across the windshield in slow yellow squares, and the thought stayed with him long after he had carried her inside and laid her down. He sat at the kitchen table afterward and did not turn on the overhead light, and he listened to the house settle around him. On Tuesday, Harper took her second walking tour of the floor. She passed Malik again. He was checking a tablet against a row of boxed shipments. Marking something with a pencil, she slowed without realizing she was doing it. "Mr. Whitcomb mentioned the new policy," she said. "More to the air than to him." "I read it, Miss Lansing." He looked up. His expression did not change. "And?" she said. "It's the company's policy. That's all I have to say." Bradford arrived from the far end of the aisle within 30 seconds. As if he could hear conversations through concrete, Harper let herself be led upstairs again, and again she glanced back, and again Malik did not look up. That afternoon, while Malik was loading a truck out at Bay 9, Maggie pulled up his name on the internal personnel screen and saw what he had written under previous employment. The lines were thin. They told her nothing. She opened a private browser tab and typed his name into a search box. More from instinct than suspicion. She did not expect to find anything. She found something on the first page. She found enough on the first page that she had to close her office door and sit down before she could read further. The first result was a corporate biography on the Vandermeer Global website. Malik Kingston, Senior Supply Chain Systems Engineer. 12 years. Designer of the Eastern routing framework that nearly every regional distributor in the Southeast was now licensed to use. There was a photograph. He was younger in it. He was wearing a suit. But it was unmistakably him. Maggie sat very still for a long moment. She read the corporate biography twice. She looked at the photograph. She thought about the 40-minute drive every morning to Belmont, and about the way the man on her floor never raised his voice, and about how the routing in Southern Bay had quietly improved in ways no one had been asked to take credit for. She remembered a small, handwritten note she had passed up to Bradford's office 2 months earlier. A note about pallet flow in the South End, written in a careful hand on the back of a shipping manifest. She had not heard back. She had assumed it was filed. She wondered now whether it had been filed under someone else's initials, and the wondering tasted like something she would not be able to spit out. Then she printed the page, folded it in half, and locked it in the bottom drawer of her desk. She tried to reach Harper 3 more times that week. Each request was rerouted. Each call was returned by an assistant. Each appointment was quietly pushed back into the following month. Bradford's office was on the floor above Harper's. He saw the calendars too, and he had been seeing them for longer than anyone in the building realized. At home that Saturday afternoon, Malik was on his knees fixing a loose porch step at Eleanor's house. Imani sat on the railing with a book open on her lap, reading aloud from a chapter about whales, occasionally stopping to ask her father whether a humpback could really hold its breath for 40 minutes. Eleanor brought out lemonade on a tray with 3 glasses and watched them both with an expression she had not worn in years. The afternoon sun came through the magnolia leaves in green and gold, and Imani turned the page, and Malik fitted the new board into place and tapped it twice with the heel of his hand to test it. Down at the corner, the streetlights came on one by one. Imani slid off the railing and sat cross-legged on the porch beside her father and asked him whether Cornelius the frog at school was a real frog or a pretend frog. He said the frog was real. She asked how he knew. He said because frogs were always real, even when people pretended they were not. She thought about this for a long time and then nodded as if satisfied. Eleanor watched the 2 of them from her doorway with the lemonade pitcher cooling on the rail, and she thought about how she had not had anyone to wait for on her own porch in a long while, and how easily a person can forget that they have been waiting at all. Across town, in the bottom drawer of a metal desk on the warehouse floor, a printed page waited. The following Monday brought the 3rd week of the new policy. Malik was late again. Of course, he was. He was always late, by the same predictable margin. Bradford walked the floor at 7:45 each morning now, clipboard in hand, marking the time himself. He did not need to be there. He wanted to be. The other supervisors noticed his presence and said nothing about it, the way warehouse people learn to say nothing about a great many things if they want to keep their jobs. Otis passed him in the corridor on Wednesday and lowered his eyes, and Bradford made a small mark on his clipboard, and the morning moved on. By Thursday, the man at Bay 7 had asked Maggie quietly whether anybody upstairs was watching this, and Maggie had not been able to answer him. By Friday afternoon, the file on Harper's desk was thick, 17 separate entries, each one stamped, signed, and witnessed. No notes from the employee, no requests for accommodation. Malik had submitted nothing in his own defense, because Malik did not believe in defending himself with words. Harper called him to her office. He came up in his work shirt, hands clean but rough, and sat in the chair across from her without being asked. Up close, he was older than she had expected, older and quieter. His eyes did not move away from her face. "Mr. Kingston," she said, "I'd like to understand why you are consistently late." A pause, not theatrical, just real. "I have a personal obligation each morning," he said. "Is it something we can adjust around?" No, that was the whole sentence. She waited for more. None came. "You understand," she said carefully, "that I have a policy to enforce. The board is watching. I understand." She tried once more. "Help me. Give me something to work with." He looked at her for a long second. There was no resentment in the look. There was something more difficult than resentment. It looked almost like sympathy. "I'm not asking for an exception, Miss Lansing. I'll accept whatever decision you have to make." He stood, thanked her for her time, and left. She watched him go and found herself in the silence after the door closed, unable to return immediately to her papers. She caught herself replaying the way he had stood up, slowly, without offense, as if he had stood up from 100 chairs like this one and would stand up from 100 more. Bradford walked in 20 seconds later. He had been waiting in the corridor. "You see what I mean?" he said. "No cooperation, no remorse. The board will need a decision soon." "I'll have one," she said. He smiled and left. She sat at her desk for a long time after he was gone. The folder remained where Malik had left it. She wanted for a moment to ask her father what he would have done, and then she remembered that her father was not the one in this office anymore, and the asking would not have helped even if he had been. She opened the folder again and looked through it page by page, each entry stamped, each time clocked to the minute. She could not find a single notation about a meeting offered to discuss accommodations, a single request for medical or family documentation, a single line of inquiry into why this particular pattern existed. The file was clean. It was also, she realized, deliberately incurious. She closed the folder and pushed it to the corner of her desk, and the afternoon light moved across the carpet, and she did not turn on her lamp for another 40 minutes. The termination order came across Harper's desk on a Tuesday morning, stapled to a memo from Bradford that ended with one sentence underlined in red. "If this employee is retained, the board will question the integrity of the new leadership." She read it 3 times. The third time, she read it slowly. She thought about her father, who had built this company from a single rented warehouse on the south side of town. She thought about the board, 6 of whom had served with her father, and only one of whom she had personally chosen. She thought about the man in the gray work shirt who had refused to defend himself, and could not entirely explain to herself why that refusal made the decision harder, not easier. She signed it. The meeting itself was brief, exactly as the morning before had foreshadowed. 17 late arrivals. Termination effective immediately. Malik did not speak, did not argue, did not flinch. When she finished reading, he stood and held out his hand. She had not expected that. She took it. His palm was warm and steady. There was a callus at the base of his thumb she felt distinctly, and would remember for reasons she did not yet understand. "Thank you for the time I had here, Miss Lansing." He walked out. In the corridor, Bradford watched him pass and let his half-smile grow into a full one. "Malik," did not turn his head. In the parking lot, Maggie was waiting beside his sedan with her hands deep in the pockets of her coat. She did not produce the folded printout. Instead, when he had set his small box of belongings on the passenger seat, she walked back into the building, took the elevator to her office, opened her bottom drawer, and pulled out everything she had been holding for 2 weeks. She sat down at her desk and pulled up a fresh browser window. She logged into a secondary system she rarely used, one her supervisor predecessor had set up for after-hours reports and never bothered to disable. Then, methodically, she attached the printed Vandermeer biography, a spreadsheet she had built over the past 8 months tracking every formal discipline action by employee race, and a 1-page summary of 3 blocked meeting requests with timestamps. She sent the whole package anonymously to Harper's personal inbox, the one she had pulled from a charity board roster the year before. She added one line at the bottom: "You need to see this before Whitcomb sees that you saw it." Then she logged out, sat back, and waited for her hands to stop shaking. They did not stop shaking for almost 20 minutes. She thought about her own children, both grown now, neither of them carrying what Malik was carrying, and she felt a kind of shame she could not put a name to. Back in the parking lot, she found Malik still standing beside the sedan, looking at the warehouse building the way a man looks at a house he has just sold. "I tried," she said. "I know," he said. "Thank you, Maggie. What will you do?" "What I always do. Find work." He drove home through the long afternoon light. When he reached the house, Imani came running out in her stocking feet. "Dad, you're home early." "Got the day off," he said, and lifted her up. He held her a beat longer than usual. She did not notice. She did not need to know. Not yet. She wrapped her arms around his neck and told him a long story about Cornelius the frog and the 3 crickets, and he listened to every word as if it were the most important thing anyone had ever said to him. That night, Malik sat on the front steps and watched the street lamps come on one by one. The kitchen light at Eleanor's house glowed yellow through the curtains. After a while, the back door opened, and Eleanor came across the side yard with a covered bowl. "Soup," she said. "It got cold tonight." "Thank you, Eleanor." She did not ask why he was home in the middle of the week. She had raised a daughter who carried her grief in private, and she could recognize the posture from 100 yards away. She squeezed his shoulder once and went back to her house. Malik sat with the warm bowl in his hands and did not eat for several minutes. Across town, in a building Malik could no longer enter, Harper Lansing sat alone at her desk and pulled a thin file toward her, and turned the first page without reading it, and turned the second. Sunday dinner at Eleanor's was a Lansing family tradition that had survived a husband's funeral, a daughter's promotion to chief executive, and the steady erosion of every other ritual in their lives. Harper arrived at 6 with a bottle of wine and a tiredness she could not quite hide. Eleanor opened the door with her apron on. "You look like you haven't eaten all week." "I've eaten, Mom. Standing up at your desk doesn't count." They sat in the dining room with the late light coming through the lace curtains. Eleanor had made beef stew, the same recipe she had been making for 40 years. "I always make too much now," Eleanor said. "The neighbor likes this one." "The neighbor?" "Malik, from next door. I told you about him." Harper lifted her glass and lowered it again without drinking. "Tell me about him again." Eleanor was happy to. She talked through the soup course about how Malik had appeared at her gate one afternoon with a toolbox and a quiet apology for the noise his ladder would make, how he had fixed her gutter without being asked, how his little girl Imani called her Grandma Ellie, and how she had stopped correcting her after the second week, how the two of them came to dinner on Wednesdays sometimes, how Imani had once spent a whole rainy Saturday in Eleanor's kitchen learning to roll pie dough. "The poor man lost his wife 3 years ago," Eleanor said. "He drives that child all the way out to Belmont every morning. He says she belongs there. He gets up at 5:30 to do it every single morning." Harper was very still. 40 minutes each way. "I said the same thing. But he said the school is the school. He told me one time, very quietly, that he had been a different kind of man before his wife passed, and that this was the kind of man he wanted to be now." Harper set her wine glass down without drinking from it. "And then, the strangest thing. I think he lost his job this week. He came home in the middle of the day on Tuesday and sat on the porch for the longest time. I brought him soup. He didn't say what happened. Harper set down her spoon carefully because her hand had developed a small tremor she did not want her mother to see. Are you all right, honey? Long week. Eleanor reached across the table and took her hand. Harper led her. When she drove out of her mother's driveway later that night, Harper did not turn right toward the highway. She turned left, rolled 50 feet down the street, and stopped at the curb. The house next door was small and tidy. A porch light burned yellow above the front door. An old gray sedan was parked beside the garage. She sat behind the wheel, with the engine off, and watched a silhouette move past the front window. A man's silhouette, a child's silhouette beside it, reaching up. After 3 minutes, she put the car in gear and drove away. Monday morning, Harper was at her office an hour before her own assistant. She walked past Bradford's empty floor and went directly to Human Resources. She asked, in a tone that did not invite discussion, for the complete personnel file on Malik Kingston, not a summary, the complete file. The file in her hands was thin. The cover sheet listed previous employment in 3 sparse lines. No company name with weight behind it. No professional credentials. Nothing that explained the man she had met across her desk. She set the file on her own desk and did not open it for almost a full minute. And when she did open it, she read every page twice. She called Maggie Doyle up to the executive floor. Maggie came in still wearing her warehouse jacket and stopped just inside the door. "Close it, please," Harper said. Maggie did. "Did you know," Harper said, "that I tried to terminate Mr. Kingston last Friday?" "I knew." "Do you have anything to tell me, Miss Doyle, that you have been trying to tell me for several weeks?" Maggie reached into her coat. The folded printout, by now soft at the creases, came out in her hand. She walked it to the desk and set it down without explanation. Harper unfolded the page. She read the corporate biography from Vandermeer Global. She read the title. She read the list of accomplishments. She read the line about the Eastern Routing Framework. The same framework her own father had paid Vandermeer a licensing fee to use. The same framework Bradford had presented to the board last quarter, as evidence of why they could never afford to compete with Vandermeer directly. She looked up. "Why did I not see this earlier?" "I tried, Miss Lansing. 3 appointments, all canceled. I left a note at your assistant's desk. It disappeared." "Disappeared how?" "I don't know how, but I have a guess." Harper folded the page and set it on top of the personnel file. "There's more. I sent something to your personal inbox last week. An anonymous package." Harper looked at her steadily for a long moment. "I opened it Saturday night. The spreadsheet. I have been reading it ever since. I read it once and put it away, and read it again at 3 in the morning. Get Mr. Whitcomb up here, please." Now. Bradford arrived in 5 minutes, smiling, already explaining something about quarterly variance. Harper let him talk for 30 seconds, then slid the printout across the desk. He read it. The smile did not entirely leave his face, but it lost its conviction. "He never disclosed any of this on his application," Bradford said. "Did anyone ask him to?" "It's not the company's job to verify. It was your job, Bradford, to bring me complete information on a personnel matter you escalated to my desk. You brought me half a story. You knew about this, didn't you?" There was a pause that lasted exactly long enough to answer. She opened a second folder on her desk. The summary spreadsheet Maggie had sent her anonymously. She turned it around and slid it across to Bradford. "And this, 8 months. 6 of the 8 employees you personally moved into formal discipline are black. The shift roster does not break that way." "Explain it." Bradford did not pick the page up. "That's raw data, Harper. What you're implying is very serious. I'm not implying anything. I'm asking for an explanation, and you don't have one. Get out of my office, Bradford." He went. He closed the door behind him with the same controlled care he used for everything, and the latch clicked very softly into place. And Harper sat for a long minute, with her hand flat on the folded printout and her eyes on the window, and the sky over Charlotte was the color of brushed steel. That evening, Harper drove again to Maple Bend. She did not park at her mother's house. She parked in front of Malik Kingston's, through the front window. She could see him at the kitchen table, a child's homework spread out, a pencil in his hand. He was leaning down to listen to something Imani was saying. He laughed at whatever it was. Harper had never seen him laugh. The sound did not reach her through the glass, but the shape of it on his face did. She gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles went pale, then drove home. She did not sleep. At 7 the next morning, Harper Lansing knocked on Malik Kingston's front door. She had not slept, and she did not pretend otherwise. He opened the door in a clean undershirt and jeans, a coffee mug in his hand, and his face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds and then settled into the same unreadable calm she remembered from across her desk. "Miss Lansing, I'm Eleanor's daughter." He did not say he had figured that out. He simply stepped back and held the door. "Come in." The kitchen was small, warm, smelling of toast and coffee. There was a child's drawing on the refrigerator, but Harper did not look at it for long. A backpack with a unicorn patch sat by the door. Imani was upstairs. They could hear her singing to herself, some tuneless song about a frog who lived in a teapot. "Coffee? Please." He poured. He did not speak while he poured. He set the mug in front of her on a plain wooden table and sat down across from her with his own. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. "About Belmont? About your daughter? About Vandermeer? Because none of those should have been the reason I kept my job. The rule was the rule. I was late." He looked at her over the rim of the cup, her own philosophy repeated back to her in a different voice. She had said almost exactly the same sentence in a board meeting 6 months earlier. "That's exactly what I would have said," she said. "I know, and I would have been wrong." He did not answer immediately. Above them, footsteps moved across the upstairs floor. A door opened. Small feet hit the stairs. "Dad, who's the lady?" Imani came around the corner in pajamas patterned with little planets. She stopped when she saw Harper. Then she smiled the way only children smile when they have not yet learned to do anything else. "This is Grandma Ellie's daughter," Malik said. "Oh," Imani said, suddenly polite. "Hi, I'm Imani. Grandma Ellie makes the best apple bread." Harper laughed. The sound surprised her almost as much as it surprised Malik. She had not heard herself laugh inside another person's house in nearly 2 years. "I know," she said. "I grew up eating it." Imani nodded, as if this confirmed something important, and went to the cupboard for cereal. She poured a careful amount into a yellow bowl, added milk from the refrigerator without spilling a drop, and sat down at the table with the easy presence of a child who had been responsible for her own breakfast for some time. Imani looked up at her and offered, with the gravity of a small diplomat, a single strawberry from her bowl. Harper took it and thanked her solemnly, and Imani nodded once and went back to her cereal, as if the transaction had been long expected. Harper stayed exactly 4 minutes longer than she had intended. When she stood to leave, Malik walked her to the door. On the porch, she turned. "I was wrong, Mr. Kingston. I want you to know. I understand that. It was an honest mistake. It was a careless one. There's a difference." He did not argue. "I need a few days. I'm going to make this right. You don't owe me anything. I don't agree with you about that." Bradford did not wait for the second blow to land. By that afternoon, he had called 2 members of the board and explained that the new chief executive was about to reverse a clean disciplinary action because of a personal connection to the employee. He used the phrase compromise judgment twice. The emergency board meeting was set for Thursday morning. On Wednesday evening, Harper stayed at the office until 10. Maggie stayed with her. They spread 3 years of warehouse performance data across the conference table and built a picture in numbers. Throughput in the Southern Bay had risen 23% during the months Malik Kingston had been on staff. 2 specific routing changes traced back to handwritten notes Malik had passed up through Maggie, which Bradford had filed away and later implemented under his own initials. Thursday morning, the boardroom on the 11th floor was full. Harper walked in carrying 2 folders. She did not raise her voice once. 3 points. First, Malik Kingston is the former senior supply chain systems engineer at Vandermeer Global, designer of the Eastern Routing Framework that this company licenses for $180,000 annually. Second, Southern Bay throughput rose 23% during his tenure. The routing changes responsible originated with him. Mr. Whitcomb filed them under his own initials. Third, Mr. Whitcomb intercepted 3 appointment requests from his shift manager and brought me an incomplete file instead. She paused. Fourth, and not on the agenda. Over the past 8 months, 6 of the 8 employees Mr. Whitcomb has personally moved into formal discipline have been black. The shift roster does not break that way. I am not the person to draw a conclusion from that number alone, but I am the person responsible for asking whether the question has been examined, and it has not. The chairman asked for a vote. 7 hands went up to retain Harper and to open a formal review of Bradford Whitcomb. Bradford walked out without looking at her. On Saturday morning, Harper drove to Maple Bend with an envelope in her coat pocket. Malik answered the door. She set the envelope on the kitchen table. Supply chain director. Reporting directly to me. Hours flexible. The disciplinary record has been removed. This isn't pity. It's the offer I should have made the first time you walked into my office. He picked up the envelope. I'll think about it. That's all I'm asking. From across the side yard, Eleanor's voice carried over the fence. You are all staying for lunch. Malik, bring the bread. Imani, set the table. Harper, wash your hands. They sat 4 at the small kitchen table. Imani told a long story about Cornelius the frog and the 3 crickets. Eleanor laughed in the right places. Harper reached for the breadbasket at the same moment Malik did. Their hands met above the bread and stopped. Neither moved for a full second. Then Malik said, "After you," and she said, "Thank you." And the moment passed without comment, but neither of them quite forgot it. One Tuesday night in late October, Harper stayed at the office past 8. She walked down the corridor and saw the light still on in Malik's office. She made 2 cups of coffee and brought them back. "Window," she said. He stood. They walked to the wide glass on the north wall and looked out over the lights of Charlotte. Close, not touching. "My mother told me you are very kind. Your mother is a generous woman." "She is, but she is also rarely wrong." A pause. "Malik, yes, thank you for taking the job. Thank you for offering it twice." That was the whole conversation. Neither of them had been looking. Not for forgiveness. Not for a second chance. Certainly not for each other. But somewhere between a broken porch step and a Sunday dinner table, between a folded page in a drawer and an envelope in a coat pocket, that was exactly what they had found. Outside, the lights of Charlotte went on burning. Inside, the 2 of them stood together in the quiet and did not move for a long time.